Owen, when I am assaulted by the enormity of the universe through recent cosmological data and information, one feels a sense of absolute awe. And you are forced to begin to ask about meaning, about purpose, about intent. I can't help it. But I'm concerned that that emotion may not be a correct one. So I'd like to begin to explore with you the question about meaning in cosmology, and I'd like to start with the Copernican principle in understanding that and see how it helps us to address this question.
Well, I suppose from the point of view of history, the Copernican step was a very serious one that made people began to question the whole idea that they were in a very small and highly significant place, sort of pointing down to a cozy cosmos, a closed world with God, the angels, the archbishops, the cardinals, all just beyond the shell of stars. And Copernicus provided a larger scale because if you cast the Earth into motion around the sun, it should affect the positions of the stars unless they were very much farther away. In retrospect, I think the shock value of that has perhaps been expanded and aggrandized, and often it goes under the title, the Copernican principle. The Copernican principle being that we are not unique, special in God's eye, that somehow we're just a relatively minor place on a small planet circulating around an ordinary star, one of billions in the Milky Way galaxy, which in turn is one of billions beyond that. The Copernican principle is sometimes thought of as the principle of mediocrity, as if somehow, supposing that we are common and ordinary and therefore not highly significant, gives us a scientific principle that will help us advance our science. I've taken a good look at this historically to see if I could find examples of where the Copernican principle could be used and where the principle was actually used. And curiously enough, in places where it could be used and perhaps have promoted an advance of science, it was not used that way. And out of the many possibilities, I found only one or maybe 1.5 cases where it could be used. So I don't find the Copernican principle a very strong principle in furthering science.
What are some of those examples?
Well, for example, and here's the case where it was used successfully. Suppose we assume that our sun is a typical star and other stars are like the sun. Then, if you cut down in some optical way the overpowering brightness of the sun so that you can compare its brightness with another star, let us say Sirius, you could, by using the principle that faintness means farness, calculate the distance to Sirius. And this was done by several scientists at the end of the 17th century, including Isaac Newton and Christian Huygens. And they came up with numbers that were tolerably good. Sirius, of course, is much brighter than the sun. So it was a false assumption, but nevertheless, it gave one of the first holes in showing how vast the starry cosmos was. You can take another example, and that was around 1950, astronomers were puzzled because if they looked out at the Andromeda galaxy, this wonderful nebulosity that is quite visible to the naked eye, in the night sky, you could see that the globular clusters around it seemed systematically different from the globular clusters around our own Milky Way system. Now, if we had applied this principle of mediocrity, of this homogeneity of the universe, and supposed that those globular clusters were the same sort as those around the Milky Way, we would have known that there was something basically wrong, namely that the Andromeda galaxy ought to be twice as far away, as we were saying. Well, astronomers puzzled about it, but that was too radical an idea to make just like that. Eventually, through a much more sophisticated path, it was discovered that, in fact, the Andromeda galaxy should be something over 2 million light years away instead of 1 million light years, as was believed in 1950.
So here's an example of where the Copernican principle of mediocrity, could have helped us.
But didn't.
But didn't, because people maybe were just too timorous to make that step.
That's right. And there were other similar cases where people didn't make the step. So that as a scientific principle, it is interesting, but not a systematically powerful way of understanding the universe.
What about going forward? Can we now use the Copernican principle in helping us to discern more about the universe, maybe multiple universes, the multiverse, which would seem to be a furthering of the Copernican principle? Or is there a danger of overusing it and using it as an absolute rule when it may not be appropriate?
By suggesting that we are insignificant in this Copernican sense of mediocrity, then it suggests that there would be lots of other life, perhaps enough like us that we could communicate with it, which I think is a little bit arrogant to suppose, if we're so mediocre, that all those other civilizations are going to be as equally mediocre to us that we could have an interesting conversation. However, though, as I say, it's a foundational principle, I'm not at all sure that it has serious scientific backing, serious foundations. It is more a philosophical principle, which is okay, because, of course, we're never going to know if we don't do the search, if there's a possibility. It's an interesting question, because it's a question that could have a positive answer, but you will never know if it has a negative answer, because you'll never be able to say there is no other intelligent life out there.
Because
the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.